It was morning, and it was snowing outside, which kept everyone at home. The children sat near the warm fireplace. Once upon a time, in a snowy, gray, and cold castle, there lived a northern dark duke. The duke was extremely cold, never smiled or said more than 3 words, never even took a hot bath or ate sweets. The boy asked Stella who this northern duke was that she was now talking about. Stella tells Michael that he will be like that when he grows up. The child asks the girl what good it would be for him to become the Northern Duke. The friend smiled at her friend's words, looking up from the book she was reading for Michael. Stella looked at Michael, replying that then he would live happily ever after with a beautiful and kind princess. Suddenly, a woman entered the room, asking the baby if she had behaved well. The child answered her mother with something unintelligible but reached out to the woman. Initially, Emily thought she died in the accident. But when the girl opened her eyes, she was surprised. Emily realized that she had ended up in another world. The girl was shocked that she was able to be reborn. The mother hugged the child, who was smiling brightly. Emily wonders who she was reborn as, already thinking that a happy ending awaits her. But then the door suddenly opens. It was the maid, standing near the door, telling Millie that she must go to the Duke's child, whom she was sitting behind. Millie replies that the baby is sleeping, so she needs to take care of her baby too. The maid told the girl to return to the Duke's child before he saw that she was not watching the child. Emily realized that she was not reborn as a princess, nor as an empress, but the girl speculates that she might have been reborn as a heroine who suffers incredibly before learning the truth of her birth. Suddenly, Millie turns to her daughter, calling her Stella. The woman asks her daughter to be quieter because they are now going to see the Duke's child together. Emily, now named Stella, realized she needed to be quiet to avoid trouble. Millie quietly walked out of her room with her daughter in her arms. Stella became a little scared because she didn't understand one thing. The child did not understand why the castle was so empty. As Millie passed the window, Stella noticed that it was snowing outside. The girl was surprised that it was snowing so heavily outside. Stella realized that she was in the northern lands. Suddenly, Millie stopped in her tracks, holding the baby in her arms. Stella noticed that her mother's expression had changed and decided to take a look at who was standing there. But when the girl saw who this man was, she became a little tense. A man dressed all in black like a raven. The child couldn't believe her eyes, but Millie greeted the Duke. And then Stella realized that the dark-haired Northern Duke was standing in front of them. In the most ordinary romance novels, the cold Duke is at odds with the warm and cheerful Crown Prince. It is very likely that the Duke has very little money now, and he is irritated that all he can do is kill monsters. Except for strength, there are no other virtues. A family that has nothing but honor. Stella realized that she was not reborn as a princess, but simply a background character somewhere in the north. The child continues to look at the Northern Duke. The man looks at Stella, who does not take her eyes off him. Millie noticed the man looking at the child, so she decided to ask what was wrong. The Duke replies that Stella does not escape his gaze, and the child immediately turns away. But the girl looked at the man again, realizing that he did not frighten her at all. Suddenly, the Duke addressed the maid by name. Stella was surprised that the Duke knew the name of an ordinary servant. Millie asks the man not to call her by name because it is not according to the rules of etiquette. The Duke did not answer the maid's words, looking at her. Stella doesn't understand why Richard suddenly fell silent. Suddenly, the Duke asks the girl if she shouldn't look after the heir. Millie began to tremble with fear, not knowing what to answer Richard. But then Stella also began to worry, not for herself, but for her mother. The Duke also made Millie his heir's nanny. Plucking up her courage, Stella tells Richard to let her mother go. But there was no response from the Duke. The girl understands that her words did not sound threatening at all. Richard looked at Stella, who was being held in Millie's arms. Without saying anything, the man turned around and walked away from the maid with the child. Stella was shocked that the Duke just up and left. Millie whispers to the child that they need to hurry to the heir. The girl looks at Richard's back, realizing that he doesn't look like a villain at all. The little girl wonders what happened to the Duke that he is so cold to everyone. But very soon, Stella will find out the reason for this man's behavior. Before entering the heir's room, Millie asks her daughter not to cry because she might wake him up. Stella replied that she understood, and she was also interested in what the Duke's child looked like. Hearing her daughter's answer, Millie reached for the door handle to open it. Stella remembers the Duke, whom she really liked. Millie opened the door to the heir's room and immediately entered, closing the door behind her. Stella pressed herself against her mother's chest, trying to warm up because it was cold in the heirs' room. Millie was horrified that the window in the child's room was open. Having put Stella on the floor, the woman ran to close the window. The girl understood that the room was somehow too cold for a child. Stella wonders how one can keep warm in such a castle. While looking around the heir's room, the girl was a little shocked by what she saw. Stella realizes that compared to her room, the room she is in right now is completely different. The girl understands that even a modest northern castle is quite expensively furnished. Hearing the baby's cry, Stella looked at the crib where the child was lying. Millie was a little confused because the heir began to cry. Stella does not understand why the boy began to cry so bitterly, because he is the future Grand Duke of the North. Millie touched the child's cheeks, realizing that he was completely frozen. Stella is terribly curious about what the son of the northern dark-haired Grand Duke looks like. Millie carefully took the child in her arms, trying to calm the heir. When Stella saw the heir, she couldn't believe her eyes. The girl was shocked at how George could be such a sweet child. Stella doesn't understand how such a charming child can become as stern as his father. The girl really liked George's eyes, as well as his chubby cheeks. The heir continued to cry, clinging to the maid. But when the boy saw Stella, he immediately stopped crying. George smiled at the girl and began to reach out his hand. When Stella noticed that the heir had stopped crying because of her, she immediately became embarrassed. Millie was surprised that George suddenly calmed down and began to smile. The girl is shocked that the boy her mother is holding in her arms is so charming. Millie didn't understand where George was reaching, but when she saw that the boy was reaching for her daughter, she was a little surprised. The maid knelt down and released the heir, who immediately crawled towards Stella. Stella is shocked that George is not only a sweet child, but also very affectionate. The girl looks at the Duke's son, realizing that from this moment on, she is not just his support, but also his loyal ally. Millie smiled at Stella and introduced George to her. When the girl heard her mother's words, she was shocked. Stella could not believe that in front of her was George Alchemon, who is the main character of the novel in which she was reborn. Looking again at the heir, Stella realizes that she really found herself in a novel called The Canary's Cage. So, The Canary's Cage ends with two lovers saying goodbye. The beautiful and sweet Lady Canaria, in an attempt to escape her war-torn kingdom, moves to the Empire and finds herself in the north, cold and deserted. There she falls in love with the fragile and modest Duke George Alchemon. In the end, weak George, unable to protect his beloved, forces her to leave. And this child is George Alchemon. It was painful for Stella to read this novel, and then she saw George's face and her heart broke. George Alchemon grew up in the harsh cold, without proper care, weak, not very smart, and never managed to protect Canaria. His only virtue was kindness. Many people asked to change the main character because they didn't like George. And they didn't like him because George was very far from the typical northern dark-haired Grand Duke. Suddenly, Stella noticed how the heir was looking at her without taking his eyes off her. George immediately smiled at the girl because she finally paid attention to him. Seeing the smile of the heir, Stella knew that there was no time to waste and decided that she would make George Alchemon the perfect northern dark-haired Grand Duke and make sure that he and the main character lived happily ever after. 7 years have passed since the girl made this decision, and it was not difficult to get used to the new world. For a while, Stella was sad about not having a phone because she wouldn't be able to take a picture of George's cute face, but she soon gave in and devoted all her time to looking after Alchemon. Stella was glad that George adored her too. After all, the heir never leaves Stella's side and is always next to her. Even now, George searched for Stella throughout the castle, and when he found her, he called her name. When the girl heard her name, she immediately understood who was calling her. Stella smiled and turned towards George, who called her. George smiled back at the girl, waiting for her to come to him. Stella approached George and suddenly indignantly asked why he called her by her first name and not Big Sister. George asked why he should call Stella Big Sister just because she is 8 months older than him. The girl replies that in those 8 months the new year has passed, so he should call her Big Sister. After hearing the explanation, George looked sadly at Stella, replying that he understood. But seeing the expression on the heir's face, Stella was shocked that even at such moments he was so cute. George was worried about Stella and asked what was wrong with her. The girl replied that everything was fine. It was just that her heart was about to jump out of her chest. The heir began to worry more, thinking that his friend was feeling unwell, and asked if he needed to blow on her heart, which made her feel better. Stella realizes that George's words were so sweet that her heart skipped a beat. Stella approached the heir, kissing him on the cheek, which made him feel embarrassed. Suddenly, the maid asked if Stella should be stopped, since it was disrespectful to George, to which another maid replied that she shouldn't do that. The maid explains to the new girl that Stella often plays with George, so she shouldn't be touched. The new girl was surprised and asked if the girl playing with George was not his nanny's daughter. The maid tells the new girl that George became very attached to Stella when he was a baby, and it was hard to handle him, but as soon as he saw the girl, he immediately calmed down and smiled. Stella, hearing the maid's conversations, was glad that the new girl had been told the truth, because the girl had really cared for George as if he were a younger brother, even before she could walk. And this was difficult for a child who could barely take care of herself. Although this did give Stella some privileges, as she was given new and expensive clothes. Also, Stella eats the same food that George eats. Stella even slept next to George to stop him from crying. In the novel, George was often ill from an early age, but he and Stella grew up healthy. The boy noticed that Stella was looking at him with a smile and did not understand why. Suddenly, Stella came up to George again, hugging him, saying that he was her ray of sunshine. The heir asked his friend what this meant, to which she replied that it meant that he was the source of her luck. George asked Stella again if he was really her ray of light. Stella smiled at George, replied that it was so, and added that she was glad that she had him. Hearing Stella's words, the boy's cheeks turned slightly blusher. George came up and hugged Stella, saying that then she was his ray of sunshine too, and the boy also said that he was glad that he had her. Stella hugged George again, telling him he was so adorable. Suddenly, the heir asked Stella why she had pink hair and compared her to a rabbit in sugar. The girl smiled and told George that there is no such thing as pink sugar. George replies that Loki showed him pink sugar because it is needed to make the Easter bunny. Stella was surprised to hear this and asked again if it was true. Stella is shocked Loki was able to get sugar because sugar cane does not grow in the north, so sugar is worth its weight in gold here. The girl takes George by the hand and says that she wants to see the pink sugar urgently, to which he replies that Loki said it was a secret. Stella said that she would take a quick look, but the boy didn't respond to this and wasn't looking at her. The girl was surprised that her friend didn't respond to this and was still looking somewhere with such a serious face. Stella decided to look where George was looking to understand what had happened. The girl was shocked when she realized who was standing behind her. George looked at his father with fear while Stella looked into the man's eyes. Stella bowed her head and greeted the Duke. Richard didn't answer the girl and looked at her. But Stella had learned something over the years. George's father, the Grand Duke of Alcman, was the most typical northern duke from the novels. Hard to believe, but his tragic backstory was exactly as the girl had imagined. The Grand Duke Alcman was left an orphan at a young age and single-handedly shouldered the heavy burden of defending the borders from enemies. He was separated from the woman he loved because they were from different classes, and the Grand Duchess, whom he later married, died in childbirth. Perhaps this is why he keeps away from everything good and is cold even to his own son. Stella looks away and says that George is not guilty of anything. George's father spends his whole life loving only one woman and believing that he deserves to be happy. It may sound dramatic in a novel, but what a miserable life it is in reality. If both George and his father were more honest, they could be happy. Stella thinks she can help George and Richard after all. She is here and knows everything in advance. Suddenly, Richard asked where Stella was going, and the girl replied that she had heard that Chef Loki had taken pink sugar from somewhere, so she wanted to go to the kitchen and see. After hearing the girl's answer, the Duke asked if she liked the color pink. Stella smiled at Richard, replying that she didn't like it. The Duke did not expect such an answer from Stella because he thought that she liked the color pink. Stella hopes she didn't come off too harshly to Richard because she's always surprised when she sees her own hair. While the girl was thinking that if it weren't for her mother, she would have cut her hair a long time ago, the Duke walks past her and George. George was sad that his father didn't ask about him. Stella noticed that her boy began to feel sad because of the Duke. The girl was angry that Richard pretended not to notice his own son. Stella apologized to the Duke and called him. The Duke stopped and looked at Stella, who asked him why he didn't ask what George's favorite color was. Stella looked at the Duke and asked why he didn't tell George anything. George walked up to Stella, trying to stop her. Stella understands that the Duke is always like this, and often does not notice her and George, but if he does notice, he only talks to her, but does not talk to his son. Stella thinks that if it comes down to it, then let Richard act as if he didn't see them, because when he only talks to her, he makes George feel like a nobody. But the Duke did not answer this and left the children. Stella is shocked that the Duke did not answer her, but the girl called the man again, who this time did not respond. Stella is angry because Richard doesn't even pretend to be ashamed of his actions. The girl starts screaming with anger, but George holds her hand and asks her not to be angry. Stella looked at George with tears in her eyes. George smiled at his friend and said that it was enough for him that she got angry and defended him. Stella felt even sadder at her friend's words than she had a second ago. The girl replies that it is sad, adding that somewhere deep down, Richard loves him more than anyone in the world. Stella says that the Duke can't show his feelings to George, that's why they don't understand each other. Hearing his friend's words, George looked at her in surprise, but he immediately turned away because he didn't believe Stella's words. George looked at Stella again and asked if she really thought her father loved him. Hearing her friend's words, Stella was about to say that she was confident in her words. George looked at the floor, not knowing what to say. When Stella once again saw that George began to be sad because of his father, she only became even more angry. Stella was about to go to the Duke, but George did not let her do this, saying that everything was fine. Hugging his girlfriend from behind, the heir says that she is his ray of light. Turning to face George, the girl says that he still skillfully uses her words. Stella placed her hand on George's cheek, asking if he knew how wonderful he was. Stella tells George that no one can ever hate him. Hearing his friend's words, George smiled, because he felt much better from her words. The heir understands that only Stella can calm him down. George is sure that if all the kindness in the world could be concentrated in one person, that person would be Stella. The boy understands Stella, realizing how much he loves her. Stella pats George on the head, telling him that he is the most charming man in the world, both in appearance and in soul, and then asks him how he manages to be so kind. George was embarrassed by Stella's words, so he didn't answer. Suddenly, George remembered little Stella, a peer who was born 8 months earlier. Other children get love from their parents first and foremost. Well, George got love from Stella. Every time he smiled or cried, she would praise him, saying it was cute. The girl with pink hair remained the same even as George grew up. Suddenly, Stella says that she hates being sad, so she offers George to drink the cocoa that she left for today. He replies that she told him that he can't have sweets. Stella winked and smiled at George, replying that today could be an exception. Hearing that Stella had decided to make an exception for him, the heir became embarrassed. Suddenly, George called the girl's name. Stella looked at George and asked what he wanted. George looked at Stella with a smile, about to say something to her. The boy smiled even brighter and confessed his love to Stella. When Stella heard that George loved her, her heart skipped 3 beats. Seeing his friend's shortness of breath, George asked what happened. Stella asks George to turn away for a second. He asks if he should turn away again. The girl confirms, because she needs to calm her heart. Hearing Stella's answer, George laughed, replying that she was something. Having finished laughing at Stella, the heir looked at her again. George smiled at the girl, realizing that there was something he could thank his grumpy father for. The heir is ready to thank his father for giving her Stella. George realizes that Stella is all he has. A couple of minutes later, Stella and George entered the kitchen. Stella decided to go ahead because she had hidden cocoa for them. The girl asks George to be quiet, otherwise they will be caught. Stella went to the cupboard and started looking for cocoa. But suddenly, someone grabs Stella by the collar, calling her a scoundrel. As it turns out, it was Uncle Loki who begins to scold Stella for stealing in the kitchen. Stella looks at Loki, who caught her. Loki says that Stella steals every day, and today he will teach her manners. Stella replies that she didn't come alone and points to George, who came with her. When Loki saw George, he immediately let go of Stella and asked the heir what he was doing in the kitchen. George tells the man that he just wanted to drink some cocoa. Loki immediately became nervous and replied that of course George could go anywhere in the castle and drink whatever he wanted. Stella folded her arms across her chest and said discontentedly to the cook that he had changed his shoes too quickly. Loki started to get indignant, asking Stella if he should address her as George, but she replied that what difference did it make if the country was founded on the idea of benefiting everyone, and there were still a lot of great people following it. And then, in front of George, an argument began between Loki and Stella. Suddenly, George asked Stella if they were close. Hearing George's serious voice, Stella fell silent and looked at her friend. Even Loki fell silent, but Stella was shocked by how quickly George's voice changed. George himself smiled sweetly at the man and his girlfriend, who had just stopped arguing with each other. Stella replied that she was not close to Loki, but the way George spoke sent a chill down her spine. The girl asked how she could be close to Loki, calling him a monster. Loki told George that he and Stella were not close and would not become close in the future. Stella looked at the cook and asked why he was so tense. Loki turned his back on the children, saying that it didn't matter, and asked them to wait while he prepared some cocoa for them. Stella doesn't understand what happened, because the cook suddenly started behaving so strangely. After Stella and George drank cocoa, they immediately went outside. The girl tells the heir that the cocoa was very tasty, and the weather is also good. The day was a success. He asks if she is in a good mood. Stella replies that she is in a good mood because she was able to drink such luxurious cocoa, and then added that it was all thanks to George. George smiled at Stella, replying that if she was happy, then he was happy too. Stella approached the heir and began to squeeze his cheeks, saying that he was very cute. Suddenly, Stella and George heard someone calling them and turned to him. Stella immediately recognized the man who called her because he was her friend, whose name was Luke. Stella ran to Luke, asking what he was doing in the garden and why he had such giant scissors on his belt. Luke replied that his uncle had asked him to help with the garden, to which Stella replied that she understood. Stella realizes how great it is that Luca is still a child and so hardworking. The girl is sure that even if Luke's beloved gets stuck on a desert island, he will definitely do everything so that she does not go hungry. And in the future, if she marries Luke, George will marry Canaria. It will not be so bad to live nearby and watch their love. Stella smiles at Luke, saying how kind he is. The girl says that it is not easy to take care of the garden, even if Uncle asked her to, but Luke replies that it is nothing. Suddenly, George asked Stella and Luke if they were close. Stella tells George that Luke is the son of Captain Colt, the head of the guard, and he wants to become a knight, just like his father. George dryly replied that he understood, but Stella did not understand why he was reacting that way. Stella says that she is friends with Luke, who is 2 years older than her, but George asks if this is true. George looked at Luke with displeasure, who was starting to get a little worried because it seemed to him that he didn't like him. Stella apologized, telling Luke that George could be shy at times, so he must be embarrassed since it was his first time seeing him. Luke starts to wave it off, telling Stella that everything is fine. Stella, however, felt the tension between Luke and George. Suddenly, Luke says that he has to go. Stella asks him if it is too soon. Luke replies that he has only finished half of the work, adding that they can chat later. Stella agrees, and George listens to their conversation with sadness. Stella approached George, saying that playing with Luke was a lot of fun, and he asked her a second time if she was close to Luke. Stella replies that they are very close and adds that Luke is good. In the original, Luke's canary cage is one of George's few loyal subjects. Luke, captain of the guard, protects the weak and sickly Duke George Alcumin at the cost of his own life. His loyalty can only be envied. Stella says that if George becomes friends with Luke, it will do him good, so they should definitely establish contact. George sighed heavily, reluctantly agreeing with Stella. Stella says that Luke is good with a sword, so he will be even better than Captain Colt when he grows up, and George replied that he understood her. Stella began to tell how kind and sensitive Luke is, how he hates injustice, how cheerful and happy he is. George doesn't answer Stella, starting to feel sad because she started praising him. Stella looks at George, realizing that he is thinking about something. The girl is touched by how cute the heir is. Even when he frowns, she even wanted to bite his cheek. Suddenly, George asks if Stella will like him as much if he acts like Luke. The heir looked at Stella with embarrassment, waiting for her to answer. Stella was a little shocked when she heard George's words. Stella immediately went up to George, grabbed his cheeks, and began to squeeze them, saying that he was so cute. George didn't find anything nice here and waited for Stella to answer his question. Stella asks George where he gets his soft, chubby cheeks, adding that it's impossible not to love him. But suddenly, Stella realized what George meant. Stella says that he doesn't need to be like Luke, because George should become the ideal Grand Duke of the North, and he asks how a duke should behave. George asks that the duke should be cold and be stingy with words. Seeing such a sweet face and George's words, Stella's heart skipped a beat again. Stella fell to her knees. George asked if she was okay, to which she replied that she was fine. She had just been frivolous in imagining the future. Stella says that George will grow older and learn fencing too, because he needs to be stronger than Luke to protect the people of the North, but the heir replies that he does not want to protect the people of the North. The girl was shocked by George's words and replies that even if the Northern Duke may be cold on the outside, inside he loves the Northern lands, as if they were a part of him. George replies that he doesn't understand what Stella is saying, but as long as she is around, he will try for her. Stella says that of course she will always be there, because until she sees him happy, she will not leave him. Suddenly George says that Stella likes people like Luke. Stella replies that she will like George even more when he becomes the perfect Northern Duke. Even Canary fell in love with George at first sight. She always wanted to take care of a weak and vulnerable man, so she will have a lot in common with him, who at first seems cold and strict, and then opens up to her. Stella smiles to herself, while George watches from the side. But then George smiles too, because Stella's words warm his heart and soul. Soon evening came and it began to get dark outside. Stella fell asleep on her own drawings, which she drew for George. George sat next to the sleeping Stella. Suddenly, the boy saw Stella's drawing next to which she was lying. George found his friend's drawing interesting. The heir does not understand why Stella painted him in all black. After George finished looking at Stella's drawing, he looked at her. The boy smiled and said the name of his friend, who was sleeping peacefully next to him. Stella smiles and tells George that she really likes the outfit she is wearing. George looks at the sleeping girl, not understanding how a person like her could appear on Earth. The heir compares Stella to the sun, because sinister thoughts and confused feelings simply evaporate while she is around. Stella smiles in her sleep, saying something unintelligible. George smiles, looking at Stella. George carefully brushes the hair from his friend's face, wondering what she is dreaming about. Suddenly, someone entered the room. George immediately turned towards the door to see who had entered their room. But when he saw who entered the room, the boy's face immediately changed. As it turned out, Richard, George's father, entered the room. George asks his father why he came by, and he replies that he needs to pick up Stella. George asks Richard why he should bother with such trifles. Richard didn't answer his son's question. The man picked up Stella in his arms to carry her into the room. Suddenly, George says that his father is using Stella as an excuse to talk to Millie. The heir says that Richard has already missed his chance, and then orders him to leave Stella and her mother alone. Richard sighed heavily and said his son's name. The man asks George not to snap at him because he is too weak to carry Stella to her room. Richard says he knows he can't expect anything more from Millie, but he just wants to show his feelings for her. The Duke added that George was just going around and bullying those Stella liked. When George heard his father's words, he was shocked that he could answer him like that. Because of Richard's words, the heir became very angry, but did nothing about it. Morning, Stella woke up in her room, thinking that the sun always shines so brightly. Suddenly, the girl realized that she was in her room, although she had originally been in George's room. Getting out of bed, Stella realized that someone had carried her into the room after she had fallen asleep at George's, but she urgently needed to wash up. When Stella entered the bathroom, she saw her mother there. Millie stood embarrassed near the mirror, looking at herself. The mother smiled at her daughter, greeting her. Stella ran up to Millie, asking why she was looking so intently at the mirror. The girl decided that someone had called her mother beautiful, but she replied that it was not so. Millie tells her daughter that she suddenly realized how much time had passed. Stella smiled, answering that maybe she would just have a dad, and then asked who he was because she wanted to see him. Millie carefully brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's face. Suddenly, the woman asks if Stella wants a father to appear. Because of her mother's question, Stella wonders what happened yesterday. Of course, Stella knew that something was going on between Richard and Millie, but she thought that it would end with them suffering for the rest of their lives, because the man was such a stubborn person, he really did call her mother beautiful. Millie tells her daughter that when she was younger, she made one mistake. That is, she did not trust the man she loved and thought that she was not good enough for him, so she spontaneously left her hometown. Stella asked if Mom met Dad afterwards, to which she replied that yes. Millie looks at Stella with a sad smile. The woman says that when she had nowhere to go, the Duke extended a helping hand to her. The man wiped away Millie's tears, telling her that day that there was no need to say anything because he understood everything. Millie says that only now she realized the Duke's love for her. The woman smiles sheepishly, adding that it is too late. Hearing her mother's words, Stella looked at her with displeasure. Stella tells Millie that it's never too late for love and there's nothing wrong with that, but the girl hopes that she doesn't regret her choice. The woman was surprised by her daughter's words because she didn't expect that she could say such a thing. Smiling at Stelia, Millie thanked her daughter for her support. Stella smiled at her mother because she was glad that she was able to help her. Suddenly, Stella asked Milla if she would really marry the Duke, but the woman began to deny it. Stella understands that if her mother marries the Duke, she and George will become related. Stella happily entered the heir's room, wishing him good morning. But as it turned out, there was not only George in the room, but also servants. The butler looked at Stella and asked her not to barge into George's room. The girl apologized for her behavior, saying that she would be more careful. When George wished Stella good morning, she immediately looked at the boy. Stella asked what kind of outfit George was wearing. He replied that he was going with his father to the ice wall of the north, so he had to dress like this. The girl was pleasantly surprised when she heard George's answer. After all, it is the tradition of the Alchemon family to go twice a year to study the wall on the northern border. George says that he is the first one to wear such a jacket and asks Stella if she likes it, to which she replies that he looks very cute in it and compares the boy to a teddy bear. The heir says that the only sweetheart here is Stella, to which the girl replies that he is much sweeter than her. Suddenly, the girl heard the butler cough discontentedly and replied that the jacket suited George very well. When George saw that Stella had become serious because of the butler, he laughed at her. And then the heir says that he thought about the fact that Stella does not have a good jacket, so he asked the servant if he could bring a new jacket for her. Stella replies that she doesn't need a new jacket because she won't wear it in the castle. Hearing Stella's answer, the butler sighed with relief. George wanted to insist on his own, but the girl said that when it snows, she doesn't go outside anyway, so she definitely doesn't need a jacket. Stella, looking at the jacket, thinks that it's so expensive. Even though George is the Duke's son, she can't accept everything from him, and she likes the snow, but there's one thing. Millie asked Stella not to go outside when it snowed because George was very weak, so if she caught a cold, it would be very bad and she might infect him. Stella understands that if she had a jacket, she would lie in the snow and not be afraid of any cold. George looked at his friend, realizing that he couldn't leave everything like this. The heir began to carefully take off his jacket. Taking off his jacket, George threw it into Stella's hands and told her to take his jacket because he didn't need it. Stella looks at the jacket, drooling over it because it melts in her hands. But the girl tells George that she doesn't need the jacket because it suits him so well, and the boy replies that it would look better on her. Stella is shocked that George gives her the jacket like that because she just comes to play with him. The girl refuses George because if he does not wear a jacket during the hike to the ice wall, he will freeze to death, but he replies that he was told that no matter how cold it is, you can't wear a jacket. When the butler heard George's answer, he immediately became angry and asked who told him such nonsense, but Stella said that he could not accept the jacket. Stella sighed heavily because she almost got caught. George replies that if Stella won't wear the jacket, then neither will he. The heir proudly stands his ground because he wants his friend to accept his gift. The butler says that since Stella is going on the hike with George, it's worth getting her ready too. Stella was surprised when she heard the servant's words, but George became quiet. Stella realized that the butler didn't just say that. After all, the servant knows what is going on between Millie and Richard. Stella is pleasantly surprised that someone already knows about their relationship because it means that the Duke does not hide his love for her mother. But suddenly Stella hid her smile because George seemed dissatisfied with the butler's answer. George asked what the butler meant by taking Stella on the hike. The boy asked the butler again what he meant by Stella going with them. The servant sighed heavily, wondering what to answer the child who was waiting for an answer. Stella sees that the butler is starting to worry because he is afraid that he will say too much. Suddenly, Stella smiles and says that it was she who asked the Duke to take her on the campaign. George looked at his friend, who answered for the butler. The girl says that she doesn't want to be separated from George, so she asks to go with them. George was pleasantly surprised by Stella's words and even embarrassed by it. And then the butler says that Stella needs to urgently go to the seamstress for a new jacket. George waved to Stella, who ran to the seamstress for a new jacket. When his friend left, George called the butler, who immediately approached him and asked what he wanted. The boy replied that he was asking the butler again about the trip. George asks the man what he wanted to tell him earlier. The heir says that if the servant lies, there may be consequences. Suddenly, the maid says that Anna told her that she saw Millie and Richard, who were together until the morning. The maid replies that she thought nothing like that was happening. Sarah says that Millie and the Duke are always walking back and forth and even exchanging glances. Sarah says that Millie has a child and she is still not afraid to walk like this. Lily asks her to be quieter because Stella is coming, who can become the Duke's daughter, so she needs to watch her language. Stella heard everything perfectly well and realized that the rumors had spread too quickly in one day. And it is very bad that the servants have spread too quickly, because it is bad, and there is nothing good in it. The girl sighs heavily, because Millie is very good-natured. So if she hears rumors, she will want to run away again, and there is nothing to expect from the Duke. He will not be the best husband. Stella walked over to George's place with a smile to play with him. George was sitting on the same chair, still wearing the same jacket he had worn yesterday at the fitting. The boy looked with displeasure at Stella, who came to play with him. Stella, smiling, asked what happened, because she noticed that George was not in the mood. George stood up abruptly from his chair as a girl started to approach him. The heir ordered Stella not to approach him. Stella just wanted to go up to him to play with him. The girl was shocked that George asked her not to come near him. But George himself was in shock, so he ordered Stella not to come near him. Turning away, the heir says that he is not in the mood for games. George politely asked Stella to leave the room, which was clearly not what she expected to hear from her friend, but she did anyway. Stella closed the door to George's room behind her, pressing her back against it. The girl is shocked by George's behavior because he had never behaved like that before. Stella was the sun for George, the only light and warmth in this world. He loved her alone. All the care that George's parents could not give him was compensated by Stella. George couldn't imagine a world without Stella and seeing anyone else next to her. That's how it should have been until the heir found out something. The butler looks at George's back in fear because he was angry. The shadow spirit is the patron beast of the clan, long known as the monster of the Northern Duke, an evil creature that feeds on negative emotions. And sometimes by people with broken hearts, because the beautiful Duchess who died giving birth to George was actually consumed by the spirit of the shadow. The butler realized that since Millie had become George's nanny, the spirit had not manifested itself, but it seemed to be because of Stella, only because of the desire not to scare her. The heir suppressed this terrible spirit. The servant is horrified to realize that now that Stella will be George's sister and someone he cannot have for himself, this is the worst possible outcome. Suddenly, George asks the butler to nod or shake his head, and it was already clear that the boy was going to ask him a question, and that was the only way to answer. The heir looks at the servant, asking if Richard has really decided to marry Stella's mother. The butler nodded his head so that George understood that this was indeed the case. When the servant nodded, the heir realized that his father was going to marry Millie after all. George is horrified by this news because he never thought that something like this could happen. And so Stella came to George again, but the servant told her that the heir would not come out to her. The girl was upset by this answer because she thought that this time he would definitely leave the room, because they had not seen each other for 5 days already. Stella realizes that it is all because of the rumors that upset George. And so Stella is crying in her room because she hasn't seen George for a week. The girl is upset that George does not want to see her because she raised him as her own child. Stella cries and hits the mattress, ranting loudly throughout the room, but suddenly someone starts calling the girl by name. Stella doesn't hear anyone and continues to be indignant, even tearing her hair out, and then her name is called again. And then the girl starts rolling around on the bed, but now justifying George because he is not to blame for this. But Stella's name was called again, only this time louder, and she finally heard. The girl turned to the door and asked who was behind it. And then Luke, who had been calling Stella all this time, enters the room. Stella was surprised that Luke came to her. The boy apologized to her, saying that he knocked, but no one answered him. Stella only now realized that Luke could have heard everything. But just in case, the girl asked her friend if he had seen her acting like a fool. Luke looked away, replying that he had only seen a little bit. Hearing her friend's answer, Stella immediately blushed with shame. Luke sat on the edge of Stella's bed and said that they hadn't seen each other for a few days, and he wondered if she was sick, but the boy realized that she wasn't sick, but still decided to ask what was wrong with her since they hadn't seen each other for so long. Stella replies that she feels like George doesn't want to see her. The girl assumes that the heir does not like the fact that a commoner like her could become his older sister, but Luke has been listening to her attentively all this time. But then Luke tells Stella that he doesn't think it's her, suggesting that George was very surprised and still not used to it. Stella says she is happy that she will soon become George's sister. And then Luke replies that he is also glad that Stella will soon become the heir's sister. The girl looked at Luke, wondering what he wanted to say. Luke says he would be delighted to hear that Stella will soon become a Grand Duchess. Stella asked if Luke would really be happy about this and the reason. The boy looked away from Stella in embarrassment, about to say the reason. But suddenly Luke fell silent, although he was just about to answer his friend's question. Stella looks at her friend, not understanding why he suddenly fell silent. Luke looked at Stella again and said that he actually came to tell her that today Richard had gathered all his servants in the hall, assuming that the Duke would announce that he was getting married again. Stella asked Luke if Richard was already going to tell them about it, and the boy replied that the Duke needed to sort out all the marriage matters before he went to the ice wall, which is why he had gathered everyone now. Stella understands that only people from the Duchy of Alchemon can participate in the march to the wall. If Richard takes her and her mother with him, it will mean that they have become part of the family. Getting out of bed, Stella tells Luke that she will go too, because many people will be against the marriage between Richard and Millie, so she should be there to support them. Luke watches as Stella begins to get dressed. Stella walked to the door, but before leaving, she thanked her friend, because if it weren't for him, she wouldn't have found out anything. So Stella went out into the street and went to Richard and Millie, thinking that they had already been told a lot of nasty things. But the girl is sure that because of this, Millie is sitting and crying. Stella is already running to her mother, hoping that she is not crying. Standing in front of the entrance, she was about to enter, but the guards stop Stella, saying that she cannot enter because the meeting is not over yet, to which she replies that she will wait then. Standing in front of the entrance, Stella began to wait for her mother, who was about to come out soon. But during this time, the snow became heavier, and the girl's head was covered in snow, and she herself was shivering from the cold. Stella realizes that it's better this way than to come after everything is over. Suddenly, doors opened before the girl's eyes, and people began to emerge from them. Mostly people who came out were unhappy with the meeting. But among the disgruntled people, Stella was able to spot her mother. Millie was the last one out, but her face was blank. The woman was shivering from the cold and was ready to cry at any moment. Stella called her mother with a smile and was already getting ready to run to her. But suddenly, someone put a hand on Millie's shoulder. The woman turned around and saw that it was Richard who was adjusting her cape. Stella saw the Duke approach Millie. Millie clung to Richard, who put his arm around the woman, comforting her. Stella, looking at her happy mother, realized that she now had a Duke. The girl understands that something doesn't add up: a thin, torn jacket, a light, colorless shirt, and socks on a bare foot, and her whole head is covered in snow. Stella thinks she was too arrogant to think she had a place in the castle, and George knew that would happen. But the girl understands that she still needs to learn so much. As soon as Stella came home, she immediately went into her room, hung up her jacket, and left her boots. The girl herself lay in bed trying to warm up. Stella knows she can't let anyone know she's sick because Millie and the Duke are about to celebrate, and she doesn't want to disturb them. Turning on her side, the girl is glad that George doesn't want to see her, otherwise he'll get sick again. Stella remembers that she is a minor character in this story, but she doesn't even exist in the original. The girl would have continued to sleep with a fever if water had not started dripping onto her cheek. Opening her eyes, Stella decided to find out where the water was dripping from. As it turned out, George was sitting next to Stella's bed, crying on her cheek. When George noticed that Stella had opened her eyes, he immediately asked how she was feeling and whether he recognized her at all. Stella smiled and asked how she could not recognize George. The girl looks at George and says that the Duke of the North does not cry, but if he wants to cry, then only alone and only a little, let out a tear or two, no more. George replies that then Stella shouldn't suffer because then he won't cry. The heir looks at Stella and says that she is the only one in the whole world who can make him cry. Stella felt her heart beat faster at George's words, but the girl understands that she should not be happy about such special treatment because George is destined to become the main character. George squeezed Stella's hand in his own, asking if she was crying, but Stella is still so happy about this special treatment from George. Stella replies that she is not crying, she just has a fever. George smiles and says that this is a stupid excuse. Suddenly, George put the girl's hand on his forehead and called her name. And then George apologized to Stella, and she asked if he was crying, to which the heir replied that he was just sweating, and the girl said that this was a stupid excuse. The next day, George also fell ill, and the maid quietly complained behind the door, blaming Stella for the illness who had infected him. Sarah says that if Stella had said she was sick, George would not have been allowed near her, but he was sick, and now the whole estate is in an uproar, and Lily asks the maid to be quiet, otherwise she will wake him up. Suddenly, Millie ran past the maids, hurrying to her daughter's room. Looking at Millie, the maid says that Stella will soon become a Grand Duchess. Millie wanted to go to Stella, but the doctor forbade it because the woman needed to prepare for the hike to the northern ice wall. The doctor tells the woman that if she gets sick, it will be a disaster, and her status will change very soon. Millie looked at the door crying. The man asked her not to worry about Stella. The doctor says he will take care of Stella and asks Millie to return to her quarters. Millie nevertheless obeyed the man and went to her chambers. Stella understands that nothing can be done about it because her mother will soon become a duchess. But the girl is interested in how George is doing, who is also sick. Night had fallen. The room was lit by a candle that was on the table. Suddenly, Stella woke up from George calling her name. Looking at the heir who was smiling at her, Stella realized that even his smile was cute. Smiling back at George, Stella ruffled the boy's hair. But then Stella came to her senses and jumped out of bed. Stella helped George get out of her bed and then took his hand and led him to the door, saying that he shouldn't be in her room because she infected him. The boy asks her not to blame herself, but she asked him not to argue. Holding George's hand, Stella tells him that he needs to go back to his room. When the heir heard Stella call him by name, he looked at the floor, smiling sheepishly. George was very glad that Stella called him by his name. The girl realized that she had been speaking informally with George all this time and assumed that she was asleep. George put his hand on Stella's shoulder, replying that it was a dream. Stella wonders how George could come to her room if he is very ill. He would just be resting in his chambers. Stella realizes that everything would be different in reality, so this is a dream. The girl hugs the heir, promising that she will make him happy, so she asks him not to worry, but just to eat a lot to grow strong. There will be no tragedy. George will not lose Canaria. He will not be alone, as in the original story, so Stella will not allow the heir to be left alone. George says that he will be happy if Stella stays by her side, and the girl thanks him, saying that she loves him very much. In the end, George never went to the northern ice wall. Stella thinks it's her fault. Luke sits on the edge of the girl's bed and says that it's okay if George goes camping next year, but the boy asks her to get well soon because Loki is also having a hard time, and she turns around and asks again. Luke says that Stella is like a daughter to Loki. Remembering how the man had behaved around Stella, she now understood why he had spoken to her like that. Luke tells Stella that when Richard returns, there will be a wedding. The girl confirmed this, and the boy asked if she was happy about this because she would soon become the Grand Duchess. Stella says that she cannot become a duchess because she is not the Duke's biological daughter, but Luke says that he always adored her and loved to listen. Stella replies that she didn't notice it because Richard is always so menacing and frightening, but the boy says that this is his usual behavior. Stella doesn't understand why she has to behave like that with everyone. What's the point of it? Because it was because of this Duke that 80% of George's childhood was spent unhappy. After the Duke was rejected, George grew up cold, surrounded by a bunch of selfish adults, but this time Stella will not allow it. For a start, she will not let the Duke die in 3 years. But Stella doesn't know how to do this. Suddenly, Luke asks that when Stella becomes the Grand Duchess, he should make her his knight. Stella asked Luke again if it was really her knight and not George's. Luca confirmed this, adding that he wants to protect the girl. Stella looked at Luke with confusion, not understanding why he started talking about this so suddenly. Suddenly, Stella put her hand on her friend's shoulder and called him by name. Stella looked at Luke with a smile. After all, he was training to become a knight, a brave knight protecting the Grand Duchess. It sounded quite tempting. Suddenly, Stella learned that Millie had gone missing on a hike. The girl looks out the window, not understanding what is happening. In all these years, in all the trips to the wall, something like this has never happened. Stella doesn't understand why this happened so suddenly. Suddenly, Stella heard the maids say that the Duke said he would protect Millie, while Sarah replied that an avalanche had descended on the Duke. Lily begins to doubt that an avalanche could have occurred, but Richard knew that it was very dangerous near the ice wall. Stella was shocked to hear that something could have happened to the Duke too. Now, the girl thinks that Richard was trying to save Millie, but that's impossible. In the original, he will die only when George turns 10, and that's still 3 whole years away. Sarah tells the maid that it's all because of the useless Millie, whom Richard tried to save, that his luck has deserted him. Lily asks Sarah to watch her language so that she doesn't call Millie useless. The maid asked Lily what she had said wrong, while Stella looked at the maids in fear. Sarah asks Lily if she remembers how the Duchess died, how sadly it happened, so it is useless to be happy for Millie and Richard's marriage. Suddenly, Stella noticed a painting hanging on the wall. The girl began to be frightened by the picture, and suddenly she saw something in it. And then Stella fell to her knees, and Luke immediately ran up to her. The girl realized that it was useless to look back at the events of the original, but Luke sat down on one knee and asked how she felt. After all, in the original, the Duke did not marry Georgie's nanny. The girl understands that these stories are completely different. In this life, unlike the original, lovers confess to each other. Stella realized that this was all because she pushed them to do this, because she did a lot of unnecessary things, and the plot changed. The girl says that it's all because of her, and Luke asks what she means. Stella replies that Richard shouldn't have died like that because in the original story, no one disappeared. Stella laid her head on the floor, wondering why it had happened so suddenly, 3 years earlier. Suddenly, someone called the girl by name, which made her fall silent. Looking up, Stella saw that it was George who was standing in front of her and smiling at her. Stella looked at the heir standing in front of her, crying. The girl understands that she took his father away from him, but she only wanted George to be happy and not sad. But in the end, it turned out quite the opposite. George walked up to Stella, put his hand on her cheek, and asked her not to cry. Kneeling in front of Stella, George promises her that he will definitely find her mother. Stella asked George again with tears in her eyes. The girl took George by the hand and said that he couldn't go looking for her because he hadn't fully recovered from his illness yet. George knelt down in front of Stella again and replied that only he could deal with the shadow spirit. The heir wipes the tears from Stella's eyes and asks her not to worry, promising that he will return safe and sound. George smiles and tells Stella not to cry, to eat well, and to wait for him. Stella looks at George's back, wondering when he became like this. The butler tells the heir that they can't wait any longer, and he answers that he understood him. George's shadow spirit showed incredible ability in searching, and after leaving, rumors spread that his spirit was a snake the size of a house, and in situations like this, it could be incredibly powerful. Everyone feared George and praised his greatness, but it takes a lot of magic to contain such a shadow spirit. Stella sat in the kitchen, hugging her knees. The girl was worried about George because she had already begun to think that something had happened to him, too. A week had passed since George had gone looking for Richard and Millie, and finally the shadow spirit had found them. When Stella was told that our bodies were the Duke and her mother, she immediately rushed into the garden. There were 2 coffins in the garden, one small and one large. The princess walked up to the small coffin and began to open it. Opening the coffin, Stella saw her mother lying peacefully in it. Millie was smiling and had little flowers in her hair. Stella looks at her mother and starts to cry because she has a feeling that her mother is just sleeping and can wake up at any moment and hug her daughter. Stella looks at her mother and thinks it's her fault. Suddenly, George came up to the girl and said that he was sorry. The heir looks at Stella and says that he did everything he could, but he was too late. Stella stood up and took George's hands, telling him that he didn't need to apologize. Holding George's hands, Stella felt cold. The girl heard that without the heir, Richard and Millie would never have been found and returned, and yet he apologizes to her. Stella says it's her fault, and George asks what she means. The girl says that it was because she supported them, but in the original, they didn't love each other, but here they fell in love. Stella says that if she had been against it, Richard would not have taken Millie on the hike, but George asks her not to worry about it because it is not her fault. The heir's words made Stella cry even more. After the Duke's death, a greedy and cruel man will arrive. This man will beat and humiliate George. This will only drive him deeper into despondency. Misfortune will only become closer. Suddenly, someone said that it turns out that Stella is Millie's daughter, and Stella and George turned around at the sound of this female voice. The evil woman, who was not due to arrive until 3 years later, was Aunt George, that is his mother's sister, and Stella recognized her by calling her Lady Camilla. When the woman heard her name, she asked Stella if she knew it, but there was no answer, and Camilla asked again if the girl knew her. George covered Stella with his body and asked who was in front of her and ordered her to introduce herself. Lady Camilla smiled, replying that her own nephew probably didn't know her. The woman says that even such an inconspicuous girl knows her name, but Stella asks again, "Is it she who is inconspicuous or something?" George replies that Stella is not inconspicuous and orders Camilla to apologize. Stella was pleasantly surprised that the heir stood up for her. Lady Camilla was angry with George and asked him if he really spoke to his guardian like that, and asked him to show her respect, while the heir was shocked by her answer. Lady Camilla is the elder sister of George's mother, Laureline. As the youngest daughter of a prominent family, Laureline was expected to marry a nobleman and enjoy life in the capital. But the marriage with Duke Alcumin became an unforeseen disaster for her Laureline, who always described her life with the Grand Duke in detail, sent her last letter just before giving birth. Laureline wrote in her letter to Camilla that the place where she lives is the devil's lair, because when she closes her eyes, she hears snakes hissing, and when she gives birth to a child tomorrow, the snakes will take her away, so she asks her sister to protect her child. After Laureline's letter, Camilla was given the status of guardian. However, Camilla not only did not care about George, she only ruined his life even more. George lowered his head and apologized to the woman. The woman introduced herself as Camilla Winter and added that until George was able to govern the duchy on his own, she would look after him and handle internal affairs. And then Camilla looked at Stella, who had been standing next to them all this time. The woman says that the first thing she will do is punish Stella by calling her an impudent servant. Stella looks at Camilla, realizing that she is at a loss. The next day, Camilla points her finger at Stella and asks what the girl is doing in the room, then orders them to get rid of her. The butler replies that Stella only lost her mother, and if she is kicked out, she will have nowhere to go. Lady Camilla asks, since when does the butler dare to contradict her? Stella looked at the woman, thinking that she spoke as if she were the Grand Duchess of Alcumin. But Camilla got angry that Stella was looking at her and already swung at her. But suddenly, someone grabbed the woman's hand, preventing her from hitting the child, who had already closed his eyes in fear. As it turns out, Camilla was stopped by the butler, who says that a lot of people are looking at her. The woman removed her hand in displeasure because Stella was protected by the butler. The girl looks at Camilla, realizing that she is turning everyone against herself with her own hands. The woman turned away from the butler and Stella, replying that the girl had to leave anyway. Camilla says she doesn't care that Stella might die of cold, but the girl understands that she must stay with George. When the woman left, the butler asked how Stella was and asked her not to be offended by her words, but the girl replied that she was not offended by her. The man says that Camilla simply misunderstood everything when she learned that Richard was getting married again. Stella replied that everything was fine, nothing to worry about. Lady Camilla is one of those people who can only bully the weak. If Stella hadn't known her from the original, the woman would have fooled her too, and since she was fixated on the girl, she would cause George less trouble. And so, Stella happily wanted to go home, but she was shocked by what she saw. As it turned out, Camilla ordered the servants to board up the doors to the girl's room so that she could not enter it. Sitting on the floor, Stella leans her back against the door, realizing that the funeral of her mother and the Duke is in a month. At least this means that until then, Camilla will not throw her out of the castle, but the girl has no idea what to do. A couple of days later, Stella met a man on the street who sat down on his knee in front of her and said that if she wanted, she could stay with them. The man says that he only has sons, so having a mistress in the house will be a joy to them. Stella looks at Kalt, realizing that Luke told him everything, but the girl replies that she can't do it then, because then Camilla will cause them trouble. The man wanted to object to the girl, but she said that if she was kicked out, she would definitely come to them. Stella promised Kalt with a smile. He smiled at her and replied that he understood her. When the girl entered the castle, she looked into the room and heard Camilla's voice. George has been literally swamped with work since Camilla arrived. Soon, Stella came into the kitchen and sat on the floor. The girl took a loaf of bread out of the red bag and began to eat it. Camilla ordered Loki to give Stella food, calling her a rat, but the man decided that since the girl was a person and not a rat, she could be given food. Suddenly, Stella heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was George who walked into the kitchen and saw Stella. Stella got up from the floor and ran to George to hug him. The girl says that they haven't seen each other for so long, and the heir replies that he missed her. And here Stella and George are sitting on the floor, George resting his head on the girl's shoulder. But suddenly, the heir noticed that Stella had lost weight and asked her if she was eating well. The girl realizes that she can't tell the truth, so she tells George that she eats well and asks how he is doing. The heir replies that everything is fine with him, he is only worried about Stella. Stella smiled at George's words, thinking that he had already grown up. Suddenly, Stella showed her little finger and reminded him that he promised that he would never lie to her and asked if he remembered this promise, to which George replied that he never lies to her. Stella asks the heir to then tell her the truth and asks if Camilla is treating him well. George was a little confused when he heard the question, because he didn't expect to be asked about it. Stella, however, realized from the heir's confusion that Camilla was treating him badly. The girl asked George if Camilla made him study a lot, if she scolded him if he made a mistake. The heir replies that the title inheritance ceremony is coming soon. He assumes that the woman simply thinks that he lacks grace. Hearing George's words, the girl looked at him sadly. The girl replied that she was very sorry and was about to bow, but George stopped her and asked why she was sorry, and then said that he just needed to try harder. Stella understands that if she had been more attentive, everything would have been different. The girl blames herself for everything that George is going through now. Stella understands that she shouldn't cry, because if she cries, George will only get worse. Suddenly, the heir called the girl by name. George tells Stella that even if Camilla treats her badly, the heir asks that she not leave the Commons. The girl's heart skips a beat because even at a moment like this, George is worried about her. The girl smiles and replies that she will always be with George. Hearing Stella's answer, the heir smiled at her. George took the girl's hand and she squeezed his hand tightly. But suddenly, the heir turned away from Stella, looking sadly at the floor. George tells the girl that he is a little nervous about the title ceremony. Stella looked at the heir, realizing that in a month, the ceremony of inheritance of George's title and the funeral of the Grand Duke were scheduled on the same day. A month has passed since Lady Camilla's arrival, the day of the ceremony of George's succession to the title, and the Duke's funeral has already been set, and the funeral of Stella's mother was quiet. The girl said goodbye to her mother. The maid who stood next to the girl tells her that it is not necessary to keep everything to herself. Loki supported the woman's words and says that she can cry if she wants to. Stella smiled tiredly, answering the maid and Loki that she had said goodbye to her mother a month ago and cried it all out. The girl looks at the coffin containing her mother for the last time and leaves with the maid and Loki. And so, Stella came to the church where Richard's funeral and the inheritance of the title would take place. The girl quietly entered the church to say goodbye to the Duke. Stella saw that the coffin containing the man was not far away and went towards it. When the girl approached the open coffin, she looked inside it. Stella looked sadly at the man lying in the coffin. The girl smiled tiredly, asking the Duke if he really cared about her mother. Stella imagined Richard holding Millie close so that she wouldn't be afraid of anything around him. The girl thinks that the Duke hugged Millie tightly, as if protecting her. Stella realized that because Richard cared about Millie, she was able to close her eyes so calmly. After all, her mother died in the arms of her loved one. The girl assumes that this was enough for her. Stella tells the Duke that George's life was not much different from his, because the heir also had a loved one, but the Crown Prince took him away, and as a result, the boy missed her for the rest of his life, suffering incredibly. The girl says that she will not allow George to suffer and live a terrible life. Stella promises the Duke that she will be there for George, and so 2 ceremonies began, one for the funeral of the Duke, and the other for the succession to the title. Lady Camilla watched the title inheritance ceremony with a smile. At one ceremony, the priest read from the book and buried the Duke. At another ceremony, a man faced George and spoke about inheriting the title. When the man finished talking about the title, he presented the heir with a medal. The ambassador declared George Alcumin the Grand Duke of Alcumin, while Stella watched the ceremony with admiration. Stella looks at George, realizing how much he has grown. The girl tells Loki that if she had a camera, she would have taken 1,000,000 pictures by now, but the man compared the girl to that same distant relative. Stella is proud of George because he just became a duke before her eyes. The girl looks at her heir with a smile, comparing him to a star. Loki, who was sitting next to Stella, saw how she admired him and sighed heavily. A few minutes later, the funeral and the title succession ceremony were over, and everyone began to get up from their seats and leave the church. Lady Camilla also rose from her seat to leave the church when she suddenly noticed something. The woman began to get angry at Stella, shouting that how dare she sit at the ceremony. Lady Camilla asks the child if she really thinks she is a great duchess, sitting at a funeral, and in a place of honor at that. Stella sighed heavily because she understood that Camilla hated her since she saw her at such a distance, although the girl understands that a woman does not need to be evil because she is such a person by nature. Loki stood up from his seat and put his hand on the child's shoulder, looking at Camilla. The man says that she has said enough because today they buried not only the Duke, but also Stella's mother. The girl looked at Loki in surprise, realizing that he was being too kind to her today. Stella smiled tiredly, thinking that her life wasn't so meaningless. Camilla blushed at Loki's answer because she didn't expect anyone to stand up for Stella, and replied that the estate was full of arrogant idiots. Suddenly, Stella says that she has the right to go wherever she wants and asks Camilla who she is to punish her. Hearing the little girl's words, Camilla became angry and immediately replied that how dare she assert her rights to her. Stella replied that she dared to do so and that she still had the right to speak out, and since the faithful servants of the Alchemans had gathered in the church. So George's ambassador has arrived, Stella will come out and say something to Camilla. Stella walked up to Lady Camilla, pointing at her. The girl says that Camilla is playing the role of guardian of the Grand Duke Ackerman. Stella put her foot on the chair and said that the woman was completely no good. The girl's words immediately began to echo throughout the church. Stella had prepared for her speech, but she realized that she had overdone it anyway. Lady Camilla got angry at Stella and called her a scoundrel. The girl understood that the woman was angry with her, but this was only the beginning. Stella points her finger at Lady Camilla, asking people to look at the woman, saying that she beat her, starved her, and even locked the doors to her room, and the girl had to sleep in the hallway, and everyone in the castle knows about it. But suddenly, Camilla couldn't stand it and walked up to Stella, waving her hand. The woman gave the girl a resounding slap in front of all the people who were in the church. Lady Camilla replies that it is only thanks to her that this duchy still stands, and instead of gratitude, they show her such disrespect. The woman asked the girl if she understood how difficult it was to manage such a household, but Stella knew that in reality Camilla had run the duchy terribly. By the time George took over, the Alchemon family was deep in debt, and the woman had simply taken the money and run away, escaping punishment, and she still dared to lie brazenly. When the girl graduated with a master's degree in business and accounting in her past life, and while she was reading how Camilla kept score, she was furious. Stella started yelling at the woman that she could also run a household, because even an 8-year-old like her could do the job better than her. Hearing the girl's answer, Stella was furious and already wanted to give her another slap. But suddenly, George says that Stella is right about Camilla. The Duke says that he trusts Stella more than anyone else, and Camilla is just an outsider and doesn't even compare to her. When Lady Camilla heard George's words, she was in complete shock, as was Stella herself. Stella noticed that George was speaking informally to Lady Camilla, and the girl realized that he had truly become a Grand Duke. After all, George was just waiting for the moment when he could take matters into his own hands. And then the ambassador approached Camilla and asked her what it all meant. The woman did not answer the man's question, but instead ran away saying that they would come running later to get her back. And so, when Camilla left and all the other people, the church became so quiet. Stella sat down on the floor, sighing heavily, because she was not prepared for this situation, because it is difficult for a child to stand up to an adult. Suddenly George approached the girl, extended his hand to her, and asked how she was. Stella took the Duke by the hand and replied that everything was fine. Her legs just gave way, he asks, even with how confidently she spoke. The girl replies that somehow it was all unconscious, and she was afraid that the woman would hit her again. She got up from the floor and asked George if he was sure of his decision, because if Lady Camilla left, who would run the household? The Duke asked what kind of questions these were, and Stella asked if there was already someone in mind. George smiled at his friend and replied that he had her in mind. Stella was very surprised when she heard the Duke's answer. Stella looks at George and wonders if he really wants her to run the Alchemon household. The girl asked if the Duke really didn't mind. She was certainly a master at accounting, but she was only 8 years old. Stella says that she doesn't even know anything about this world, and George asks what she's talking about. And then the Duke took the girl by the hands and said that he believed in her. Stella asks George if she ends up destroying the Alchemon duchy. The Duke asks if the Grand Duke's estate falls. She will be with him. The girl answers that of course she will be with him. George smiled at his friend and said that in that case, he had nothing to fear. The girl looks at the Duke and is already melting from his smile. Stella tells George that she will always be there and protect him for the rest of his life, and no one will deceive him or let him down. But the boy replied that the girl is so funny. Stella looks at the Duke, not understanding why he is laughing if she said it in all seriousness. The girl smiled at George, promising herself that she would make him happy. Meanwhile, at Lady Camilla's mansion, the woman received a letter from George that didn't seem to be very good. After all, the letter demanded compensation for errors in the paybook. Lady Camilla was horrified because she helped her nephew, and instead of a reward or gratitude, they demanded compensation from her. Stella says Lady Camilla tried to steal money from a 7-year-old child. The girl was angry at the woman and asked if she was ashamed. The guards conveyed these words of Stella to Camilla, who, upon hearing this, became even more angry. Stella looks out the window with displeasure as a woman on the street starts to get angry and shout at the guard. The maid approached Stella and said that she knew that she was an unusual child, but still asked her how she knew all this. Stella simply smiled without answering the maid's question. As the girl sorted through the papers, the workers watched her with interest. But suddenly, Stella felt people's gazes on her and decided to turn towards them. The workers didn't look at the girl, but went about their business. But suddenly the servant stopped asking Stella questions, which made her very happy. One day, Stella called George to her and told him that he would now train more in fencing. After all, the ruler of the North must be cruel, so it's time to turn George into the ideal Northern Duke. Morning, Stella woke up from the sun's rays in the room. When Stella looked at her watch, she realized that she had woken up on time. The girl checked to see if anything hurt and if her eyelids were heavy. Stella was so happy when she realized that everything was okay with her. Getting out of bed, the girl gets ready to go to work. But no matter how much Stella looks at the room in which she slept, she can't help but admire it, and in general, this is the room of the Grand Duchess in the Alchemon's castle. The girl once again fell asleep on the documents that had kept her busy. Even in her dreams, Stella saw a pile of calculation papers. The girl had so much to do, and not to miss anything, and she often fell asleep in the office, since the common bedroom was located in the farthest corner of the building. And all this would have continued further if one day George had not seen this. The Duke told Stella that the Duchess's mother was supposed to sleep in the room anyway, so the girl could use it. That's how the girl got the Grand Duchess's room. Stella had always wanted to sleep in such a luxurious room at least once, and she had nothing to complain about. As soon as the girl washed herself, got dressed, left the room, and decided to take a walk around the castle. When the maids saw Stella, they wished her good morning, to which the girl wished the maids the same. One of the maids noticed that Stella was in a good mood and asked about it to make sure she was not mistaken. Stella answered the maid with a smile that she was indeed in a good mood today. After all, the Great Alchemon Festival is just around the corner. On this day, George will become a fully grown adult, and Canaria should appear very soon. In the original, when George heard about Caranria, he didn't even come out to see her. Instead, he simply invited her to stay in the best room, the Grand Duchess's chambers, then at the ball, which Caranria took as a greeting and fell in love. Stella is so happy that she will finally see a romantic scene between George and Canaria. It is necessary to carefully prepare the first stage, namely the ball, at which the love of George and Canaria will blossom. Stella understands that this part of the story cannot be screwed up, and no bad endings. Suddenly, Anna asked if there would definitely be a ball in honor of the festival. Stella confirmed this, reminding that they had even prepared everything. The maid said that she could not believe it because George despised any social events, like a ball. Last year at the coming-of-age ceremony, Stella's ceremony ended with a simple blessing from the bishop. There was no traditional first was after the ceremony, as George refused it outright. Stella smiled, realizing that this was George, their Northern Grand Duke. But the girl is so glad that the Duke agreed to arrange a ball, because this is definitely a good sign. The maids are so happy that they will finally be able to properly greet the Grand Duchess. Stella was shocked that the maids found out that Canaria would be a duchess, but the girl wondered how they found out about it. The girl thought that the maids had guessed that George would marry when he came of age, and so she confirmed the words about the duchess. The maids looked at each other, saying that they were very happy about this, but Stella thought that the girls were so happy that they would finally leave their affairs in the castle. Stella understands that Canaria will definitely be able to take care of everything, and the Alcomans will no longer need an accountant, although the girl will be glad to retire from business, living in the castle, because she still needs to get a job as an accountant somewhere. The girl tells the maids that she hopes George will recommend her somewhere to look for work. The maids answer that of course they will recommend Stella, and the girls trust her. The girl tells the maids that she is tired and will go to rest. The maids shout to Stella that she will succeed, because she already has the most valuable thing, but the girl thought that by something valuable, the maids meant money. Stella understands that she may look like someone who has a lot of money, since she deals with finances, but that doesn't mean that it's her personal money. And so, the girl walks down the corridor, thinking about her own things, not noticing anyone. Suddenly, Stella bumps into some man in the corridor. As a result, the girl crashed into the guy because she was lost in thought. The man smiled at Stella, asking the girl to watch where she was going. Stella raised her head and looked at the man she had crashed into. At first, the girl saw the chest of the man she actually crashed into. Then Stella noticed the man's dark hair. And when she moved away from the man, she realized that George was standing in front of her. The girl is shocked that she crashed into no one else, but into the Duke. Stella smiled at George, realizing that every time she saw him, she was immediately overwhelmed with emotion. Thanks to Stella, George is no longer a weakling, because in the original, Madame Camilla humiliated him, so he was never able to grow up. But George, who was raised by Stella, grew up so tall and muscular like a sculpture. The girl looks at George and realizes that she was able to make him the ideal Grand Duke of the North. Every time the Duke smiles, Stella begins to lose her head. Stella tells George that she asked him not to smile so brightly. The Duke answers the girl that he cannot help but smile when he sees her. Stella understands that such a slight smile is a deadly charm, but it suits George. The girl smiled at the man and wished him good morning. The Duke asks Stella to call him by his name. The girl walked away from George, replying that she would never do that. Even if Stella is in charge of the Alcomyn Duchy, the girl cannot call the Duke by his name. In addition, the girl understands that if she calls the Duke by his name, Canaria may later misunderstand everything. But Stella understands that there can be no later, because Canaria will soon meet George, but the girl is glad that she finally reached the beginning of the original story. Suddenly, the Duke asks Stella if she had breakfast, to which he receives a negative answer, so the guy suggests having breakfast together. But George saw that the girl for some reason began to doubt, and asked the reason, and she answered that the guy always makes her overeat. Suddenly, the Duke replies that Stella is so thin and also too short, but the girl begins to deny this, saying that he is simply too tall. Stella explains to George that even if you eat a lot, you won't grow taller, because height is 80% dependent on genes. The Duke began to tease the girl about her height, telling her that she was born with such a short stature. Stella didn't appreciate George's joke and told him that she wouldn't eat with him. The Duke asks Stella to eat with him, and if she doesn't eat, then he won't either. The girl thinks that the guy is playing on her pity. Stella realizes that this is just a trick to make her eat more, so the girl doesn't fall for it. Turning towards the Duke, the girl repeats that she will not go to breakfast. Suddenly, George made a sweet face and asked Stella if she really would leave him to eat alone. As it turns out, this expression on George's face is a direct hit to Stella's heart, but the girl understands that this is all because the guy has grown up, and she began to see him less often. After breakfast was over, Stella made her way to her room with great difficulty. Soon, Mira came to Stella and asked what happened to her in the morning. The girl replies that she doesn't want to talk because she's going to throw up, but Mira asks without details. Mira looks at Stella and asks when she will learn to say no to people. But Stella would have watched as Mira tried to resist the Duke's dazzling smile. Suddenly, Mira tells Stella that a suspicious woman tried to get into the castle and asks what to do with her. The girl understood that it was Canaria, so she answers that the face wants to see this woman. Having got into the carriage, the girls set off on their journey, and then Mira began asking Stella if she remembered what she did as a child. Mira asked Stella if she remembered how she made the Duke take a bath in cold water, telling him that the great northern Duke only bathed in cold water, and then he got sick, and the girl felt ashamed because of such memories. Stella justifies it by saying that they were children then, but when George got sick, the girl remembers how much she cried because of it. But one day Stella took George's white mink coat. Although he is sensitive to the cold, thanks to this, the guy laughed and said that he was not cold at all, although he was only wearing a shirt. Most importantly, George became a real Northern Duke, so Stella spread rumors throughout the capital. Having delved into the depths of her teenage mind, Stella came up with the most horrific nicknames, but anyway, after all this, George became who he is. As soon as George arrives in the capital, people will realize that the rumors were a lie, and besides the guy, there will be beautiful Canaria there. Mira looks at Stella and asks what she is up to. The girl folded her arms across her chest and pretended not to understand what Mira was talking about. Mira asks Stella why she insists on seeing the stranger in person, since the counselor doesn't do that. The girl understands that this stranger is most likely Canaria, but she definitely won't say it out loud, so at such moments she uses her secret weapon. Stella answers Mira that it was all her premonition. Mira asked again, to which she received confirmation, and then a question whether her premonition had ever let them down, to which the girl answered negatively. But then Mira says that she was just wondering what kind of nonsense Stella wanted to do. She asked when something like that had ever happened. Mira replied that there were no objective reasons, adding that it was just a subjective guess. Suddenly, Mira asked if Stella was delighted when she turned off the hot water, to which the girl answered that she should stop because she was already ashamed, but the girl in glasses answered that Stella was shaking with fear, trying to utter at least a word in front of George. Suddenly, Stella remembered how she went into some room and found a sword there. Then the girl took the sword in her hands and began to say something unintelligible. When the servants heard Stella talking with the sword, they were shocked by it. Therefore, the workers immediately moved away from the girl. Stella makes excuses to Mira, saying that she thought it was a magic sword, but the girl reminded her that it was George's sword. The girl raised her head, looked at Mira, and asked why she went with her. Mira replied that she didn't want Stella to come alone. Stella was a little shocked when she heard the girl's answer. Mira says that if someone simply invaded the castle, the Duke should take care of it himself, or at least send the captain of the guard. Stella listened attentively to Mira, not daring to interrupt her. But when she heard about the captain of the guard, she told Mira that Luke was weak towards women, adding that he definitely failed. After all, last week Luke even went on a date with a girl he barely knew. The guy who was just a simple village boy yesterday has grown up to be a heartthrob. When Mira heard that Luke was weak towards women, she immediately started laughing. Stella asked Mira why she was laughing, to which she replied that the girl had said something funny, referring to Luke and his relationships with women. The girl still didn't understand what made Mira laugh so much. In any case, while Stella and Miru were arguing on the road, they arrived at the gate before the girl noticed it. The walls of the duchy are unusual. They cover populated areas, all in order to protect against animals and monsters. These wide and high walls are called ice walls, a giant fence of ice that no outsider can get past, and although no one can cross it, Canaria still managed to do it. Stella got out of the carriage smiling, and Mira followed her. As soon as the girls got out of the transport, 2 men from the guards approached them. One of them asks what brought Stella to them. The girl answered that she was told how someone crossed the border. The man confirmed this and then asked how it was connected with Stella. She replied that she knew it was a girl, and he was surprised that even the sex of the offender was reported. When the gates opened, the man started walking a little ahead, showing the way to the girls. Stella asked the man if they were being bullied. He began to deny it. The girl replied that they had a hard job, so she thanked him for working so well. And so, a couple of seconds later, they found themselves in a dungeon, where violators are usually kept. When the man approached one of the cells, he took the key out of his pocket, and while he was opening the lock, he said that there was a girl in that cell, for whom they had come. Stella starts to get a little worried because the main character is right outside the door. The girl hopes that Canaria will fall in love with George at first sight. If Canaria remains to live in the northern lands, then the Duke will finally live happily. As soon as Stella entered the cell, she came a little closer to the stranger and greeted her with a smile. Canaria looked at the girl and asked who was standing in front of her. When Stella heard the girl's voice, she immediately understood why her name referred to canaries. Stella introduced herself to the girl and asked if she could introduce herself. At first, the girl didn't respond to Stella's hair. But the stranger asked Stella that if she introduced herself, she would believe her. The girl did not expect such an answer, but she understands that she is answering this way because she is simply defending herself. Because after all, she was caught on foreign lands. Stella tells the stranger that if she turns out to be a noble girl locked up here, they might have problems, so she asks the stranger to give her name. Hearing the girl's answer, the stranger immediately took off her hood. The girl asked how Stella knew she came from a noble family. Stella replies that she is not so blind as to not notice the scarlet opal phoenix that hangs around her neck. The stranger is shocked that she was recognized only by one piece of jewelry. Mira approached Stella and asked what it all meant. The girl replied that what she said meant that. But a second later, Stella answers Mira that the girl sitting in front of them is a noble guest who crossed the ice wall to come to them. The girl extends her hand to the stranger, saying that she just wanted to say hello. Stella extends her hand to the girl and tells her that she is welcome to the Alchemans. Having finished their business at the border, the girls set off in a carriage back to the castle. But now, not just the two of us, but now the three of us. Stella and Mira decided to take Canaria with them. They couldn't leave her in the dungeon. Looking at Canaria, the girl understood how beautiful she was, because as expected, this unearthly beauty, even in the original, brought troubles upon her with her marriage to the crown prince and the emperor's plans. Suddenly, Canaria asked Stella's name again, since she seemed to have heard it poorly in the cell. The girl replied that the girl could call her advisor, or just by her last name. The main thing was that she was comfortable. And then the princess asked if the Duke knew that she was here. Stella replied that he asked her to make sure that it was she. Canaria replied that Stella seemed very perceptive to her. The princess asked Stella if she knew why she had come to the northern lands. The girl replied that she understood, because this marriage was still being discussed. Canaria responded that it was not just an engagement, adding that everything was much more complicated than it actually seemed. The princess says that the emperor not only has a wife, but also a bunch of concubines, and since she does not want to be one of them, he vowed to burn her homeland to the ground. Karen Rhea is only 19 years old, and the emperor is already about 50. The emperor is confident that all the beauties of the world belong to him. And the crown prince thinks exactly the same. He will come to the Duchy of Alchemon, which rightfully belongs to George, create a scandal, and leave. But this time, Stella will do everything to ensure that the crown prince does not take a single step towards them. Canaria smiled at Stella and then asked if she could sleep, to which she received a positive answer. After a couple of seconds, Canaria was finally able to fall asleep. Stella looks at the princess, realizing that even in me she is a beauty. Suddenly, Mira says that now Stella knows about Canaria's situation, and then asks what she will do. The girl asks what she can do. Mira says that after listening to Canaria's story, she already understood that the girl would cause them a lot of problems, because she is perceived as a reward. Mira says that if the emperor finds out that Canaria is hiding with them, he will definitely not stand aside, but Stella replies that Mira is a little confused. Stella says she didn't reveal her name or her status. The advisor says they are simply protecting a girl crossing the wall and tired from the journey. Richard was named the Grand Duke of Alchemon for his ability to protect the North, but in other words, the man said he would give George the title if only he would sit and keep his head down, and in fact, the duchy is self-sufficient, because George is literally the prince of a small kingdom. Suddenly, Mira asked Stella what kind of madness she was thinking of, to which the girl replied that it was George anyway. Mira sighs heavily, saying that she hopes Stella doesn't screw this up. When the carriage arrived at the castle, the girl was the first to get off it. Suddenly, Stella saw George go outside. The girl thought that the Duke was going somewhere, but she didn't understand where, because no trips were planned for today. Suddenly, George saw Stella out of the corner of his eye, who was standing next to the carriage. The Duke immediately ran to the girl and put his hands on her shoulders. George asked where Stella was, because it was clear from his expression that he was worried about her and had been looking all over the castle. But suddenly, raising his head, the Duke saw something he never expected. A girl got out of the carriage whom George clearly did not know, and the guy asked who the girl was. Stella answers the Duke that this is the girl who crossed the wall yesterday and arrived in the duchy. She came from the kingdom, so the advisor personally brought her to them. George wanted to talk to Stella about the stranger crossing the line. Canary got out of the carriage and greeted the Duke. It was clear from George's face that he was unhappy that he had a guest. Stella smiles and tells the Duke that the girl is so tired and exhausted, and asked if he could let her rest. George looked with all seriousness at Stella, who was smiling at him. Turning his back on Stella, the Duke tells the girl to do as she sees fit. Stella didn't expect George to answer her like that right in front of the guest. The Duke walks away from the girl, leaving her with the girls.